Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to do a review today about the podcast 99% Invisible. It is my favorite podcast that I listen to, and as Spotify has told me, last year it was my most listened to podcast. One time I think I listened to 9 episodes in a row while I was baking one day, so I have definitely listened to a lot of it, and I think I have a pretty good sense of why they are popular and why they're good at what they're doing. So to give you some background on the podcast, 99% Invisible is a podcast that is about design and architecture, and it can really be anything that impacts your daily life or the daily life of someone around the world. It's not very architecture heavy. Certainly I wouldn't know what to do with that, but a lot of it ends up being about social design, how programs are designed regarding people, or even just how people interact with certain things. Some of it is current events and some of it is more historical, but almost always there's some part of the story that you can relate to or find interesting. There are certain episodes that different people will skip because they don't have interest, but most of the time, most people would find some aspect of the podcast interesting. So one thing that they do that I think they're really successful in is having something really consistent about their podcast. So every time they have the same overall narrator, Roman Mars, and he's like the producer in charge of the podcast. He's got a soothing voice, so you want to tune back in. And he gives a quick intro of the story, what the podcast is going to be about, and then passes it off almost always to a different correspondent who has gone somewhere and done the research, called up a bunch of people, or what have you, to find the story that they're going to talk about today. But it's always Roman Mars at the beginning, and it's always him at the end, giving his thoughts about what happened in the episode, any takeaways, and then saying his catchline phrase of producing the podcast, Rainbow Road in beautiful Oakland, California. Every episode starts and begins the same, which really helps people to always know what they're getting themselves into when they tune into this podcast, which I think can be really helpful for retaining people. I would say that the podcast really does a good job in having this general theme of social design, but being able to expand that into so many different sectors and ideas. They never seem to be doing the same podcast twice. It seems like they're always coming up with something different to keep people engaged on a new idea or a new topic, which can be really interesting. They definitely try to utilize music in the background of their episodes to keep people engaged and maybe give them an emotional baseline for how they might be feeling about a certain story or piece. And I think another thing they do well is it's not always the same one person talking. As I mentioned, Roman will pass it off to a different correspondent, but even then, they may be guiding the story, shepherding it, but they're not the only person talking. They really try to get interviews with the direct parties involved, or people, if it's more historical, who have done research about those figures, so that you're getting a lot of different audio stimuli to really keep you engaged and interested and listening to the podcast all the way through to the end. Another thing they do, which I think is really interesting, is oftentimes the stories they pick have so many different facets to them that you could spend hours talking, not just 40 minutes. But they always have a coda at the end, which is a sort of a little tidbit at the end that didn't quite fit into the story, some side branch or a related topic, and they wait until the very end to talk about it. And usually it's less than 5 minutes, where the rest of the podcast was 30 or 40. And I think it helps to keep people listening all the way to the end, but also to make sure that they aren't having to get off track in the middle of their actual podcast, and that they can really focus in on what they're doing, craft a tight narrative, but still be able to come back to whatever fun fact or interesting thing they discovered at the end of it, which is also fun for the listener to have that little reward at the end of listening to the whole podcast. So that was what I thought about 99% Invisible. I think it's a really great podcast that uses a lot of different strategies to keep people engaged and coming back. And yeah, I hope you guys give it a listen. I think it's a really great one. All right, thanks.